kick off the day. Hope everyone had a good breakfast. First announcement that I've told to make is the B sessions are downstairs, but I think you're in the better session, so I hope you stay here. So we're going to kick off the morning here on a session on the role of clean, firm, and gas technologies. Looking forward here. Steve is going to introduce the panel. I'm just going to introduce Steve briefly. Steve Capanna is a policy director at the Crux Alliance, which is a climate philanthropy focusing on high-emitting countries. I've known Steve for a long time at the Department of Energy, which his latest role was Director of Technology Policy in the Office of Policy. Steve is also a native Philadelphian. So if you have any questions, please ask him, but do not bring up anything about Philly sports. As you imagine, he's insufferable about the Eagles or the Sixers, so please refrain from that. Really looking forward to the day, looking forward to kicking us off this panel, and Steve, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, True. Hi, everybody. I actually do think that I'll spend a few minutes on the Sixers, if that's okay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for coming early on a Tuesday. This session is going to talk about resources for firm capacity services. And as you see in the program, sort of the motivating question, sort of driving what our presenters are going to talk about is our systems plan for increasing clean energy. Does gas still have a role, or is clean firm capacity ready to fill the gap? And I think we have a really strong group of diverse perspectives to discuss that question today. We have sort of researcher perspectives, manufacturing, planners, utilities, and then we also have different geographic perspectives. So we have the international perspective, state perspective, regional. So I think it's going to be a really rich and interesting conversation. I'll very quickly introduce our panelists and then also give them sort of a longer bio as they come up to speak. So first, you already heard from True. True is not on your schedule. Elaine Hart, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it at the last minute, but True is stepping in to speak on her behalf. She's a visiting fellow at ESIG. Jenny Zhao is a senior manager of market development at Wärtsilä, North America. Matt Kalemba is VP of Integrated Resource Planning at Duke Energy. Jason Frasier, Senior Manager of Transmission Planning at the New York ISO. And joining us remotely, you'll see at least his slides, maybe his face, I don't know, in a moment, is Max Schoenfisch, who's a power sector modeler at the International Energy Agency. So I think that this conversation, as I was thinking about sort of what we wanted to get at, I think there's sort of like two different timeframes that this question is really interesting in. There's sort of the short term and the long term. So short term, as we have increasing electricity demand right now, and as there's sort of heightened awareness and concern about both affordability and reliability, to what extent do we need to build new gas? And to what extent will that, then lock us in for a long time for continued expansion of fossil resources? Or can clean energy meet the demand, both in terms of wind, solar storage, but also maybe demand side management or increased grid flexibility or increased utilization of existing resources that are already on the grid, including fossil resources? And then longer term, as we think about getting to really clean, sort of beyond 90% clean systems, and thinking about what we then need to invest in to get beyond 90%, to what extent do we have those technologies ready? Which technologies are we really talking about at this point? How much confidence do we have that they will be ready in 10, 15 years when they're really needed? Or again, is gas really going to be the tool that we need to rely on to ensure the reliability and relative affordability of those systems? I think this is a really interesting time to have this conversation, again, because of the sort of heightened focus on affordability and reliability, and also, of course, in the changing policy landscape that we find ourselves in now. So I want to get right to the panelists. So without further ado, True Mai will be our first speaker. As I said, he's a visiting fellow at ESIG, comes to ESIG after 16 years of experience in energy research at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where I had the distinct misfortune of working with him multiple times. And is also co-author of the new ESIG report that you may have seen came out yesterday, From Goals to Plans, improving the rigor, transparency, and decision-making in electricity plans with ambitious policy targets. So without any further ado, True Mai.
All right, thanks, Steve, for that introduction. We could just go in an infinite for loop of introductions between the two of us, but let's break that. So I'm not Elaine. Elaine apologizes for not being able to make it here. She had an illness in the family, so I'm standing in. Elaine did provide these slides, so I'll try to do them justice. And just to motivate the Clean Electricity Planning Task Force that we just completed and released the report that Steve mentioned. Obviously, over the past 5-10 years, most folks in this room know that there have been a lot of new 100% clean energy standards in the states. I think currently there's 16 states with 100% clean energy targets. Most of them are in the 2040-50 period. Their corporate, their utility targets for 100% or net zero or carbon neutral targets. You'll hear about some of them on this panel today. The point of this task force was not to discuss the merits of the policies, but to discuss the technical challenges, the solutions that the planning studies that we've seen to date have identified, and recommend some new best practices that could be implemented when one studies kind of deep decarbonization. And to start off with that, I think many of us are familiar with these kinds of charts that show kind of the marginal abatement cost versus the amount of emissions reduction or the amount of clean energy onto the system. And what the studies have found over the years are that, getting pretty far, 80%, 90% perhaps, can be accomplished at relatively low cost because we have the technologies in order to do that. It's really the last mile problem, the last 10%, last 20%, where the costs start to rise non-linearly and to very high levels, in this example, up to $1,000 or so per ton of CO2, of avoiding the next increment of CO2. So this task force is really focused more on that last mile than the first 90%, if you will, and a set of questions that I won't read off on there. But just to talk about this unique challenge of the last mile, this is a study conducted by E3 for the New England system. The bottom chart shows weekly average generation over the 52 weeks and a zoom in for one of the peak winter weeks. So this is a system with 85% emissions reduction. So starting to get into that regime that I was talking about earlier. During this most critical week, you have periods where there's low wind and solar generation, and those periods could last over multiple days. And in this particular example, that gap that you see in gray is being filled by existing fossil. Remember, this is an 85% emissions reduction scenario. You still have your existing gas facilities, and it's providing, these services over a 2-day period at roughly 30 gigawatts for a 50 gigawatt system. And really that fossil is providing this resource adequacy in these troubling periods. And when you go all the way to 100%, you need to avoid all of that gray with something else. And what is that something else is one of the big questions. What technologies can fill that gap that motivates this panel? Of course, if you look at the bottom bars, those grays don't happen very frequently. There aren't a lot of periods where you have this. So there's also an economic challenge to this when you have relatively low utilization. So it's that combined factor where you need the technologies to be available during critical periods, but probably not for most of the years. It's your standard peaking problem that in this case occurs in winter that we really needs to find a solution that doesn't have emissions associated with it. So we reviewed 16 such industry planning studies that looked at scenarios of net zero or 100%. And they look across many technology solutions. There are existing solutions like conventional geothermal, biofuels, hydropower, but those solutions typically don't scale. So they're not really applicable for all regions or most regions or to the extent that's needed. So these studies all include some form of emerging technologies. You can see the list there: hydrogen, advanced nuclear, advanced geothermal, carbon capture, long duration energy storage. And what's interesting that we found out is that these solutions are assumed in these planning studies and assumed to be available relatively early in the time frame. Many of them are assumed to be available in the next 5 years. And many of those assumptions around technology availability are set really by the target year and not by a commercial readiness assessment of the technologies. So that's sort of one of the things that we were going to recommend is to look at some of those technology uncertainty questions head on in our planning. So us focusing a lot on the technology aspects, really the task force focused on many aspects of these planning studies and offered these 4 recommendations. We won't have a lot of time to get into all of them, but we'll talk about each one in just a summary form. The first one is the technology uncertainty question that I've already raised. One of the recommendations is to look across many scenarios spanning both technology costs, performance, and availability assumptions, but not just do that scenario analysis, but also focus on what is your robust near-term decisions that are robust across all of those uncertain future scenarios. Number 2 is look beyond your electricity system. So what we notice is as you look at these deep decarbonization futures, there's greater interactions between the power sector and other sectors in other regions, or there could be at least. Examples, hydrogen, direct air capture, they consume a lot of electricity, so that will impose even higher clean energy requirements. So accounting for that self-consistently is an important factor. There are infrastructure requirements for pipelines and storage for new molecules, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, for example. And then there's also competition between the electricity sector and the rest of the economy. Many jurisdictions that have electricity clean energy standards or clean electricity standards also have greater economy-wide decarbonization targets that will compete for biofuels, compete for hydrogen, and the like. So that's an important factor there. Embrace transparency in new areas of complexity. There's 2 areas of complexity that we really highlight in this report. One is policy complexity. We need to make sure that you're complying with the policies that you set forth. Quite frankly, a lot of our electricity planning tools aren't able to capture some of those policy compliance. Tracking annual targets and credit trading in our production cost simulations, for example, is not a common practice. So there are areas of improvement there. And then also on the operational side, a lot of these planning studies focus on the capacity expansion problem and the models associated with it. Some do a more comprehensive assessment of reliability. HECO has a great example going through RA analysis, going through production cost analysis, all the way down to stability analysis. So that's a really important area given the drastic change in the power system in many of these scenarios that we recommend continuing, not just conducting that analysis, but reporting that analysis within kind of the resource planning process. And the last one, ultimately, all this planning is to inform near-term decision-making. Steve mentioned kind of the 2 timescales of this, and really how do you use the information from these planning studies and translate them to practical near-term decisions. This is a busy slide, but I'm going to spend a couple minutes just walking through them because it's a useful example of what that might look like. So essentially, I already mentioned spanning many scenarios of technology uncertainty. That's captured by the various columns in the table that you see here. And in the rows, how those scenarios interact with decisions about existing fossil resources is an important consideration. Whether or not those fossil resources could be retired in an earlier time frame or need to be retired to meet those policy requirements? Should they be retrofitted to run for carbon capture or for hydrogen? Or should they be retained but fuel switch to have a lower emission fuel source like a biogas or so? However, it's not just those options, but the economic implications of all those options, which is demonstrated in kind of the bottom row there. If you're going to have an accelerated retirement, that's going to shorten the financial lifetimes of your capital assets, in which case raise the costs effectively for everything. Getting accurate upgrade or retrofit costs, getting accurate fuel costs that account for the cost of infrastructure and whatnot. So just seeing this mapped out and laid out on the interactions of this transition to your power system with your existing resources could influence how you plan your fossil fleet or your existing resources is an important factor that we also raise. And with that, I'm going to close and thank you all. Again, Elaine apologizes for not being able to make it. We did release this report just yesterday. It was so hot off the presses that it didn't make it to Debbie's slide of all the 2025 reports, but now it's here. Please check it out. Feel free to talk to me or contact Elaine at Sylvan Energy for more information. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Drew. I should have mentioned up front that the way we're going to organize the panel is that I'm going to ask everyone to hold their questions until the end. So everyone's going to give a presentation first, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience questions at the end. Next, I want to introduce Jenny Zhao. Jenny's a senior manager of market development at Wärtsilä North America, where she advises the company's business development organization on wholesale electricity markets, energy policies, and resource capabilities that support decarbonization while highlighting the critical role that flexible gas generation plays in the evolution of the power grid. So very relevant for this conversation. Jenny, over to you.
All right. So True actually makes super good time. So I can 2 more minutes to me. And good morning. And thank you all for waking up early and choosing this session. So again, thank you, True, for setting the stage for this panel. It's actually a great segue to the topic that I'm going to share next, which is making a case for a specific type of commercially ready and sustainable fuel ready, or commercially available and sustainable fuel ready natural gas technology. And to be more specific, it is the flexible engine power plants, also known as RICE. So it stands for reciprocating internal combustion engines. Not to be confused with natural gas turbines. RICE has many flexible attributes, and I will definitely go into details later with that. All right, so in today's flow, we will look at the new era, this new age of resource adequacy in the country, and consequently the emerging and increasingly important role, as well as the value of generation resources with flexible attributes in today's context. So first of all, this is our vision, our company's vision of a path to net zero. So look where we started and look that last mile, you know, the final goal of the net zero. And every step of the way on this path, there is a place and role to play by flexible engine power plants, or RICE. We can run on sustainable fuels in that 100% renewable energy future by complementing other sustainable energy resources. And the transition in between is equally important, if not more, because we don't want to lose, sacrifice that reliability of our system. So thanks to RICE, their technology attributes, they can support a smoother transition by replacing those less efficient, aging thermal fleet, and continue to enable the build out of renewable energies by balancing their intermittencies. So with that stage set, let's zoom in to today, to the current day, and start with level setting, right? It's fair to say today we are sitting at this inflection point in terms of resource adequacy and reliability needs in the US. Across the systems, we are seeing this trend of shrinking reserve margins, despite the fact that we're still building new generations, we're still bringing them online. And I will show a couple regional examples here. So MISO, they met their planning year 25-26 RA requirements. However, right, let's not get comfortable here because surplus is reducing. And from the bottom chart, we can see this is from their futures design workshop. It is showing a widening gap of the installed capacity versus accredited capacity. A similar trend or observation is also shown from New York ISO's recent 25-34 Comprehensive Reliability Plan. It identifies no immediate reliability needs. However, the futures simulations, they do point to significant reliability shortfalls in the coming decade, and I'm sure Jason will dive into details there. So, those were just two regional examples, but they're certainly not alone in this situation. And speaking of resource adequacy and reliability needs, our challenges in this new era goes beyond not having enough capacity surplus, right? The when and where is becoming unprecedentedly concerning. So for example, time of day. The system stress is shifting to those twilight hours when your wind is not available, when you don't have any solar power, and your traditional dispatchable fleet, they cannot start up or ramp up fast enough to satisfy that fast net load ramping needs. And this graph is again taken from NYISO Futures Design Workshop. It's a snapshot of a day in 2042 is in the future. However, this phenomenon is already being observed, has been happening in many regions, including ERCOT and SPP. And let's not forget about seasonality. Reliability or resource adequacy is becoming a year-round concern. It's no longer just about those summer peaks. It's about winter morning, winter evening, and during spring and fall, we tend to have, or we are seeing more of these volatile weather events. And then we have high load, and they are compounded by the critical thermal generation, scheduling their planned maintenance and outages during those months. So all those factors come together and brew a perfect storm for potential system stress and risks. So with those being said, let's take a pause here and ask ourselves the question, how do we meet these challenges head on? What tools are available and how do we make the best use of them? There are many studies, reports out there done by system planners, regulators, third parties, and there's a common theme there. They're calling for dispatchable resources. However, not all dispatchable resources are created equal. And this is where I'm going to dive into those flexible attributes that differentiate RICE or flexible engine power plants from gas turbines or peakers. There are certain attributes that the system is calling for urgently, which makes RICE perfectly positioned to provide that support. For the sake of time, I'm only going to dive deeper with a few of them. So let's take a look at the heat map on the right-hand side here. This is a 12 by 24 heat map plotted from actual plant operating data in ERCOT. We have two RICE units compared to two aeroderivatives, gas turbine operating data. And from this heat map, we can clearly see that flexible engine power plants or RICE, their running profiles covers more than those summer peaks. So compared to popular peaker turbines out there, RICE have much better heat rates. We can achieve high 7, low 8s. We have more operational flexibilities, and that means under 5-minute startup time, very fast ramp up speed, much shorter minimum run downtime, and virtually, this is very important for maintenance, virtually unlimited starts with no cycling damage to your equipment. So that is important for the equipment longevity. And modularity, on the other hand, can also it's also important, which means smaller nameplate. The engines come in 10 to 20 megawatt per piece per engine. That allows more flexible scheduling of your planned maintenance with lower impact. And modularity can also provide potential benefit from an EUE perspective when you look at planning criteria. So all those attributes make RICE, make flexible engines more of this balancing asset to the grid compared to a peaker, which again, like I mentioned earlier, is that year-round and have resource available to meet demand all the time. And weather, we just talked about extreme weather events, volatile weather patterns. So a really big differentiator here to technology is weather tolerant. So The line graph here is showing the derating due to high ambient temperature, and we just pick showing our engines, which are the top 4 lines, and then typical peaker gas turbines, frame turbines, or aeroderivatives, and you can clearly see the benefit of virtually no to very minimal deratings from RICE engines. And cold. I am not built for cold, so I very appreciate this feature that RICE are designed to endure cold temperatures to as low as -40 Fahrenheit. This makes a huge difference in operating in those colder climates, as well as during winter storms. We're showing a map here. All these 4 power plants are currently operating. They're operating plants using Wärtsilä RICE engines. These power plants performed through the record low temperature during Winter Storm Uri in 2021. Also, I failed to mention with a high temperature derating, gas turbines are prone to those issues, and so that's just a big differentiator there. So with all that features explained, when it comes to the decision of procuring capacity or new resources, we can't really overlook that dollar sign. I am showing here a recent outlook published by Ascend Analytics, and it is clearly showing there's an advantage of RICE over gas turbines in terms of net CON. While, we can all debate the exact amount or magnitude of how much this advantage is, however, directionally, qualitatively, this is showing that third parties are recognizing the value of flexible resources in today and futures energy, ancillary, and capacity markets. So one takeaway here is when we look at resource adequacy, energy assurance, when we look at planning, maybe, not only look at them from a modeling perspective, but also think about cost and value, which I know many entities are doing that. And then with our planning criteria, right, let's evolve from using that single LOLE standard, but also incorporate like EUE, LOLP, etc. There are other subject matter experts that can speak to that more educatedly. But those planning criteria and the consequent capacity accreditation methodologies, market designs, etc., we can all improve on those to better assess the value of flexible generation resources, as well as incentivizing its investment, which can actually result in possibly more cost-effective solution packages. So to wrap up my sharing here, final thoughts, we are living in this new reality of resource adequacy and system needs while still working towards that net zero future. So as we're putting together this toolbox to address the challenges, we need to take a more holistic approach, considering and maximizing those attributes such as operational flexibility, weather tolerant, and keep affordability in mind. So hopefully today I have planted a seed for RICE with the audience, as it is a tried and true technology and sustainable fuel ready to be deployed at scale at a reasonable cost. It plays a critical role in supporting system needs in today's context, and it will continue to be an integral part of a diverse and balanced grid of the future, complementing other sustainable energy resources and or other grid technologies. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Very interesting conversation on the way that equipment can provide some of the flexibility of technologies to integrate more variable resources and sort of variable demand. Introducing now Matt Kalemba, who is Vice President of Integrated Resource Planning at Duke Energy, where he has been on that team since 2014. And prior to joining Duke, Matt spent 14 years in the oil refining industry. And Matt, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, so as my bio said, I was in the oil refining industry for 14 years. When I left the oil refining industry, my boss at the time said to me that I was crazy. I was going into industry that I was going to be completely bored in compared to oil refining. Now, the reasons oil refining is not boring is because it's completely unreliable and it was a difficult place to work sometimes, but the electric utility industry is experiencing one of the most exciting, challenging, impactful time periods that I can think of. And it's really exciting to be here and being able to share some of the work that's going on at Duke Energy. So before I dive into, I do want to talk a little bit about the Carolinas resource plan we filed earlier this month. But before I do that, I just want to give an overview of Duke Energy. So we operate one of the largest transmission distribution systems in the country. We operate the largest regulated utility nuclear fleets in the country. We are operating across 6 states. Each of those 6 states have very different politics, very different policies. But at the end of the day, when we put out our resource plans are aiming to be plans that provide reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean energy mix. And that's where we've been moving since 2005. We've been transitioning our fleet, but nuclear has maintained its position in our resource fleet. I do want to, because we're going to talk about the Carolinas resource plan, I do want to talk a little bit about resource planning and some of the things we think about. When we're starting our plans, we think about all these different influencing factors that are taking place. There's inflation, extreme weather, there's public policy issues, there's supply chain problems, there's dozens more issues, and everything is kind of swirling underneath us. But at some point we have to stop and say, okay, let's settle in. What's our base assumption going to be? And let's get to work on developing a resource plan. And we get into our modeling and analytics, and we'll do all sorts of sensitivities off of that base plan or those base assumptions. But all that analysis, and just like any good utility planner should have, you should have some sort of acronym to go with. And we use DART. Our plans have to be defendable, auditable, repeatable, transparent. I mean, I'm sitting in front of regulators. My team's sitting in front of regulators, answering questions. We're in litigated proceedings frequently where we're on the stand. We're answering data requests from interveners. So we have to feel really good about the plans that we're putting out and that the data we're using is the best data that we have available to us. So with that in mind, we've done all this analysis. The top line is that our plans are going to be reliability focused, execution informed, which we're going to talk more about here on this panel, I'm sure, minimizing costs to customers, and increasingly clean and diverse resource mix. So diving in a little bit to the Carolinas, Carolinas is a bit unique. We have 2 utilities, Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress. They sort of sit next to each other and a little bit intermingled. We operate across 2 states, North Carolina and South Carolina. We have to file a resource plan in North Carolina every 2 years. And in South Carolina, we file our resource plan every 3 years. When we file a resource plan, one of the things that we're looking for is approval to execute on our near-term actions over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's approval to go out and start filing CPCNs for certificates of public convenience and necessity for new generation, approval to go out for RFPs, approval to start spending dollars on things like continuing to evaluate new nuclear options and things of that nature. So we're looking for that approval from our commissions, and then we're also giving our commissions, our customers, an idea of where we're headed beyond that 5-year term. Okay, so I talked a lot about influencing factors. I just want to focus in on a couple more here. We are seeing unprecedented load growth. I'll cover that on the next slide, but it is across the board. We've seen people like to live in the Carolinas. There's population growth there. We're seeing our share of data centers, AI. We're seeing industry move back into our states. So it is a dynamic time when it comes to load growth. From a policy landscape, of course, the federal government has their policy landscape that is changing by the minute. At the state level, we also have state policies that we need to keep our pulse on and make sure that we're planning and meeting our state's goals. We have about 9 gigawatts of coal remaining on our system. That coal is expected to retire over the next 5 to 7 years or so. And we need to be thinking about how we orderly retire that coal retirements to maintain reliability and provide value for our customers. Resource costs, of course, that is exceedingly dynamic, whether we're talking about gas turbines, if we're talking about solar, storage, new nuclear, where are things headed with inflation? What's happening with tax credits? How does that impact the costs of our resources? And then, of course, technology advancements. We have to be thinking about what's going to get us to that carbon neutrality in 2050. Is it going to be new nuclear? Where does long duration energy storage, not just 8-hour storage or 12-hour storage? What about seasonal storage? What's the next big technology that we can be using in our resource plans? So I do want to double click quickly on the growth that we're seeing. So over the past 15 years, we've seen about 10 terawatt hours of load growth in the Carolinas. Over the next 15 years, we're projecting 80 terawatt hours of growth. Put that in perspective, the state of South Carolina used about 83 terawatt hours of energy in 2023. So over the next 15 years, we're adding about another state's worth of energy onto our system that we're trying to plan for today. So when I talk to groups within Duke Energy, when I talk to external groups, there's people like to get a little bit in the weeds and details, and then we have to try and remind folks what we're trying to do, and we have to raise it back up and get everyone on the same playing field. What we're trying to do is solve a very simple equation. It's complicated to get there, but it's a simple equation, right? We have customer demand growth over time. We have to build or plan for a little bit more than that to maintain reliability. And we've got resources today that is meeting the current demand growth. Over time, those resources are retiring. So then you have this gap, and that gap is the resource need that we're trying to plan for. So specifically in the Carolinas, we have about, like I said, 9 gigawatts or so of coal left that's on our system that's expected to retire. We have another 9 gigawatts or so of existing gas that's going to be retiring over the next 15 to 20 years. So that's 18 gigawatts or so of capacity that needs to retire. And it's table stakes for us to go ahead and have replacement resources to be able to retire that coal to maintain reliability. And then on top of that, you got to worry about the additional load growth that we're seeing. So over time, by the time you get out to 2050, we're talking about 37 gigawatts or so of new capacity that we would expect to see on our system. And again, that's a combination of replacement resources as well as resources to meet additional growth needs. So how do we fill that gap? So in our resource plan that we filed in October, we're proposing a diverse mix of resources to fill the needs that our system is seeing. The chart on the left here is cumulative capacity that we're expecting to add over the next 20 years or 25 years. And then the chart on the right is the capacity mix in 15-year or 10-year increments, I suppose. So what are we adding? We're adding solar, significant levels of solar. We're adding a lot of storage onto the system, combustion turbines, combined cycles. We're expecting new nuclear to play a role. And then we do see out in the late 2040s, offshore wind coming back into the picture. From a capacity mix standpoint, total capacity that we're seeing on our system by 2050, we're projecting about 55% of the capacity coming from renewables and storage. We're expecting a little bit over 20% of the capacity to come from nuclear. And then the rest of the capacity is made up of things like CTs, CCs, demand side management, customer programs and things of that nature, filling the rest of the gap. So that's capacity. On the energy side, and I'm going to close with this slide, we can see where energy is headed and where it's been. So this chart starts all the way on the left in 2005. In 2005, our energy mix was about 50-50 between nuclear and coal. Transition to today, we've got now more of a mix of gas, solar, coal, and nuclear still on our system. And then what you see over time, particularly over the next 10 years, gas does increase, coal decreases. As coal decreases, that energy is being made up by both solar and gas. Nuclear stays flat. We do have uprates planned that are going to slightly increase our nuclear energy over this time period. And then once you get into the mid 2030s or so, that's when you start to see other technologies show up, such as new nuclear, primarily. But you also see gas start to decline over that time period. One, because of these new technologies coming online, but also because we're retiring the gas that we have on our system today. We're also adding quite a bit of solar, and again, wind comes back into the picture out in that time period as well. So as you can see, we've got a lot of challenges ahead of us, but this is a really exciting time. I'm super excited for our company to be executing on this research plan on behalf of our customers, and we're going to move forward with developing this diverse resource mix on behalf of those customers. So appreciate everyone's time today. I look forward to more discussions throughout the day. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. So from the Carolinas, we're now going to move up to New York. Jason Frasier is a senior manager of transmission planning at the New York ISO and leads the long-term analysis and development of the bulk transmission system. Over 20 years of experience in the power industry, he's currently focused on evaluating the evolving power system in New York and identifying needs and opportunities for cost-effective transmission solutions. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Just to share, this is absolutely one of my favorite conferences to go to, ESIG. Engaging topics, great opportunities to mix and mingle, but most importantly, the question and answer is my favorite part because you all are going to come up and ask some really excellent questions. So looking forward to it. So I'm going to talk about dispatchable emission-free resources, a term that we use in New York to kind of represent the same thing as clean firm that we're talking about on this. But when you look at all the NYISO documentation and reports, you'll see our reference to DFRs or dispatchable emission-free resources. So I'll use them synonymously throughout the presentation. So three main topics I'd like to kind of go through with everybody. So first, just current system trends. Where are we at today in New York? What are we seeing on the grid? And then into these dispatchable emission-free resources, kind of review what we have currently that actually falls under this category, then go into some of the clean energy policies that are really driving the development of new resources that match this type, and then kind of go through what we see out the next 20 or so years in terms of development. And then lastly, just would like to touch on natural gas and its role, natural gas generation, its role in New York today and projected in the future. So to level set, like all good planners should do before you run a 20-year study and tell everyone what's going to happen in 20 years, let's understand what's actually happening today. So we don't go too far off course. So just by the numbers, NYISO has about 700 generating units. Our peak load was around 34,000 megawatts back in 2013. I'm nearly certain if we didn't have as much behind the meter solar and DER resources, we would have broke that record within the last few years. But because those behind the meter resources are keeping peaks down, we actually haven't really approached that record well, close, but haven't broken that recently. We have over 11,000 circuit miles of transmission that we manage at the ISO. And then our 2024, our annual energy demand was about 151 to 152 terawatt hours. So that's magnitude wise, we're actually pretty close to Duke. Yeah, so there's some similarities. So where, past 5 years in terms, so this slide's on demand. Last 5 years, we've been relatively flat in terms of peak and energy demand. But going forward, we expect a very large increase in both peak and energy use, as well as a transition from summer peaking to winter peaking. So I know you've seen these kinds of trends before. We are starting to see them actually happen, driven by policy. So what we see is about a 1 to 5% annual energy increase between now and 2045, 0 to 2% on summer peak. And really that's driven, the zero is coming from, hey, if we electrify mostly on the space heating side, we're actually going to see movement away from potentially keeping peak flat and then movement over to the winter peak. And then that calls in 2 to 8% on winter peak. So the chart on the right is showing you here's where we are, where we were in 2024. And that's that 151 terawatt hour number. And then going forward, we have 3 scenarios that we really project out to. One with lower projection, midline, and then high. So you can see on our high forecast by 2045, there's a chance we actually double our energy use in the next 20 years. And of note, that chart does not include, as of last week I checked, we have over 10,000 megawatts of large load in terms of capacity in the interconnection queue. And that would make up data centers, advanced manufacturing facilities, being incentivized to come to New York State. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. Interestingly, this chart looks a lot like Matt's, and even the start date is the same. So it's really neat to be able to compare back and forth between 2 regions. So again, where are we today? This 2005 through 2024. So this is all historic though. Last 5 years, we have seen growth in renewables. These almost in its entirety are state procured renewable resources. So our NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, contracts for the state renewable resources and gives out RECs. So that's a real driving factor in the last 5-ish years to put more solar, wind, offshore wind on the system. So you can see that reflected in the last few years. But really, if going back to 2005, you see a phase out of coal, just like you saw in Duke. And then you see nuclear relatively stable. But one difference is back in 2020 to 2021, we actually had a 2 gigawatt nuclear plant retire. And that's where you see natural gas, which is a little below 50% at that time in terms of energy, go up above 50%. So the replacement resource for the nuclear was, for the most part, was natural gas. So as of right now, we're actually serving our energy in New York with over 50% natural gas fired resources. We say dual fuel here, dual fuel. We mean that it's capable of running on a secondary fuel, but for the most part is natural gas. So yeah, and then on top of that, just with the nuclear, we're seeing retirements of resources and the addition of renewables. Okay, so lastly, transmission. So we covered demand, we covered generation, and then can't forget transmission. In the last decade, we've built over $10 billion of bulk transmission projects. Some of those attributed to NYISO's public policy transmission planning process, others attributed to state-run processes to procure those projects and build those. In general, what you're seeing on the bulk side, our desire to create more transfer capacity through the bulk system to enable connection to both existing resources that were bottled, as well as new resources that maybe we didn't have access to before. So 2 quick examples are kind of center of the state. The yellow bunch of lines is our AC transmission projects. Those went in service a couple years ago and increased transfer across the system in New York by 1,000 megawatts, which is fairly significant. And then a project, and those were already installed live today, in another project we have under construction set for completion in 2026 is Champlain Hudson Power Express. That's the big green line that you see coming down from Hydro-Quebec directly into New York City. And that's 1,250 megawatts of capacity, and will be relied on for clean energy and actually for reliability as well in the city. Okay, so that's where we are today. Where are we going to go in the future? And what about these DFERs? So DFERs do exist in concept in the system today. You know, we're looking for dispatchable and emission-free. So if you look at today's energy mix on the left and then today's capacity mix on the right, on the left, you can see, as I said, over 50% natural gas, but the two bars, yellow and blue, represent nuclear and hydro. So New York today is over 40%, you know, energy served by DFERs in concept. So nuclear and hydro. Some questions about the ability of existing nuclear to be dispatchable, but they are firm and they're emission free. So I'm going to put them in there today. For capacity, those two bars are a bit smaller, so 11% and 9%, so about 20%. And then again, a majority of the capacity in New York State is fossil fuel natural gas units. So going forward, what do we see for growth of these technologies, potential technologies? So New York State has a climate, some strong clean energy policies. In 2025, we actually hit our first milestone for these policy targets, in that we targeted 6,000 megawatts of distributed, so behind the meter solar, are distributed throughout the system. And we actually met that with 6,415 installed. Going forward, I think we have quite a bit of a tougher challenge. So 2030, we have 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar, 6,000 megawatts of batteries. More importantly, 70% renewable energy. On the chart I just presented, if you kind of squint and do some accounting, today in terms of renewable energy, we're at about 26 or 27% in New York. So in the next 5 years, we have to make up quite a bit of ground on this. So we've actually recognized that, states recognize that we're effectively lagging behind on this goal, and has said publicly that 2033 is a more realistic year for this, due to significant challenges in procurement and other cost-based challenges. So I think that one's going to be tough. In 2035, we have a zero emission vehicle mandate. And another kind of important one is 9 gigs of offshore wind. Today, we have 1 project in service, 2 under construction, for a total of 2,000 megawatts when complete. But beyond that, we do not have any contracted or under construction projects. So the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind is going to be a tough target as well. And then going out to 2040, 100% zero emissions electricity across the state. And that is our kind of cornerstone goal that right now stands. So we're planning for it. So what do DFERs have to do with these goals? So what we did is, using our capacity expansion model in the last system and resource outlook study we ran, we actually hard coded each of these goals in. We split out and did 3 different scenarios that have some varying options for technologies, but pretty close to the same, but most importantly, load. So load in terms of peak and in terms of energy. So you'll see 3 bars clumped in the 2030 and 2040. And then on the left was 2021, close to today, just as a reference point. So if I look at 2030, what you see is a large growth of solar, large growth of wind, and then some energy storage resources. So those are the resources that we're building out to meet that 70% renewable by 2030. So we can add those in, and then we meet that. And that's an energy-based target. So when we put these in, we still need to be able to balance out the system when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. So to some extent, we do have batteries that were installed and chosen. But more importantly, in my mind, is we retained all natural gas resources. The model found that to be the most kind of optimal way to do it and to be able to balance the system. So what you see there, with the exception of the state scenario where there's some forced retirements, everything that we saw existing in 21 still existed in 2030. Now, if I go out to 2040, which is where we have our hard-coded 100% zero emissions goal, you have to retire all of the natural gas resources. We see a large, so there's no more orange, which is natural gas. We see large growth again from 30 to 40 in terms of land-based wind, offshore wind, and solar, some additional storage. And then is the purple hashed bars that represent our dispatchable emission-free resources. So we basically allowed the model to choose these resources. We had 2 cost profiles that it could select from. But our intent with this is just to show the gap, right? We don't know what they are effectively right now, but if we can identify the gap, we know at least the magnitude and generally cost profiles on what's required. So observation-wise, I mean, there's at least the same amount as natural gas that exists today, in most cases more. So to the magnitude of 20 to 40 gigawatts of resources by 2040. So again, how much? 20 to 40 gigawatts in the next 15 years, which is a quite a tall task. And, you know, to some extent, we don't exactly know what type might be available. So again, existing, we have hydro and nuclear that meets part of the need. But also what are we going to build next? So storage is an option. Some good news is new nuclear in New York State is becoming more of an option. In June, the governor of New York State actually announced and directed the New York Power Authority to begin evaluations and potential procurement for at least or no less than 1,000 megawatts of new nuclear in New York State. So that's something to keep track of, but it appears nuclear is an option. And then finally, hydrogen, it's worth to mention, lots of complexities with it. It is included in some of the state modeling as an option, and there has been some pilot projects. So it is being evaluated, but right now it does appear that new nuclear is kind of that new capacity to meet the DFR requirement that is being in earnest explored. When and where, two real important topics that when you dig into, you see add a lot of complexity. Where, I mean, if you're building new nuclear or any combustion turbine or any combustion technologies now, and batteries is very hard to include in kind of population dense areas. So, and then the wind, we need it as fast as possible. So I gotta speed up, right? Yeah. Okay. So hurdles, development timeline is going to be a real issue. 15 years is not a lot of runway for building new technologies that everyone else is quite honestly competing for as well. So supply chain will be an issue. Permitting is a major issue in New York State. It takes a long time to permit and to kind of move through the process. 20 to 40 gigs is a lot in technology. There's still questions on what kind and what types, and then cost. You know, everything is costing more these days. So I want to get to real quick natural gas. I know my time's up, but I'll steal some of True's. So natural gas, something I really do want to hit on is today we're using natural gas a lot. You know, it's meeting our energy, it's meeting our capacity and our reliability needs. Recently in 2 reliability reports, one of which Jenny did a great job covering, another one which is a little more recent that went a little bit farther to say we actually have reliability needs in New York City and Long Island, meaning we're approaching or violating different criteria and effectively need to procure solutions to meet reliability in 2 very population dense areas. Big reasons are we're, you know, first middle chart here, we've added over 2,000 megawatts since 2019, but we've retired over 4,000. So we're net negative there. And a lot of the additions are renewable, but a lot of the deactivations are kind of firm fossil fuel resources. So we're losing some flexibility and capacity. And then again, on the right, we're running into severe risks in terms of aging generation. New York State being one of the first power grids in the country from Edison's Pearl Street Station in late 1800s. A lot of our generators are well past their expected lifetime. So a chart on the right just shows energy contribution by age. And you can see 70-year-old fossil fuel generators are being used today to help meet reliability on peak, generally in the city. So that's not a great place to be in terms of risks of equipment failure. in just aging and retirement. Now, how about during our transition? We in New York, we know it's needed. We have it today. We're going to continue using it. As I showed, load is increasing. So we're going to need to add as much as we possibly can in terms of renewables to meet the goal, but we also have to meet load. Like we have to be reliable. So there's been some questions, well, why can't we build new natural gas? It would have increased efficiency, we'll have reduced emissions compared to existing resources, but there's a lot of permitting challenges. There's an effective ban on building natural gas generation in New York State right now. And they're fairly costly if you want to procure greenfield sites. And something we were exploring in recent studies over the last year is the repowering option. We do think it's very plausible. We get both the efficiency emissions gains, but also extended lifespan of existing sites and then some cost savings associated with equipment such as land, pipelines, and electrical connection. And that's all I have. Looking forward to all your questions.
Thanks very much, Jason. Our final speaker is joining us from Europe, so is joining remotely. Max Schoenfisch is a power sector modeler at the International Energy Agency in Paris, where he conducts power sector modeling and long-term scenario analysis for the world energy outlook, with focus on power system flexibility and electricity security of supply. And prior to joining the IEA, Max worked as an energy economist and consultant in Germany. I see his slide, and so I will now see if we can hear his voice. Max, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
You can. Great. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Happy to be part of this very interesting panel and discussion here today. Yeah, even if unfortunately not in person. Yeah, I would like to take this opportunity to present some of the IEA's findings on the evolving role and the outlook for thermal and clean firm technologies in low emissions power systems across the world. So before we proceed with that, a quick reminder of the scale of the transformation we are witnessing today, which is taking place globally. So what you see here on this slide is the share of low emission sources in electricity generation in our stated policies or STEP scenario. So in the World Energy Outlook, which I am that's the team I am working in, and that's the annual publication we produce looking at trends in the global energy system. We have a baseline scenario, that's the steps, and what this figure is showing is the share of low emission sources in electricity generation in different regions in this scenario. So across the world, electricity systems are getting cleaner. By 2023, low emission sources accounted for about 40% of the electricity produced globally on average, which is also roughly what they are contributing in the US. And this is up around from a third in 2015. So we have seen quite a bit of progress since then already at the global scale. And the key development there really has been the rise of China as a global market leader in the deployment of clean power technologies, including renewables, solar PV, wind. They've built a lot of hydro, and also a lot of the new nuclear under construction around the world is actually being built in China. If talking about solar PV, for example, China is breaking records every year in terms of capacity additions. In 2023, for example, China commissioned as much PV as the entire world did in 2022. And the same is true for battery storage. So it's very much China that is driving this increase. But as you can see, when comparing 2015 to today, this increase has been taking place in other regions too. So there's a general trend globally towards a cleaner electricity system. Now, looking ahead to 2035, we expect transitions to continue to accelerate as clean power gets up to speed in most markets around the world, Some of these markets, most notably the EU, will approach very high levels of low emissions generation by 2035. So actually levels which are consistent with a 1.5 degrees pathway if they were replicated across the entirety of the world. And overall, clean power we expect clean power to grow about twice as fast as overall electricity demand. And by 2035, low emissions sources reach about 2/3 of global electricity generation, which is a 70% increase from today. So the yellow dot represents today, and the increase is about 70%. Now, this has, of course, significant implications in terms of the kind of technologies that are pushing this forward. So in terms of contribution, we have, of course, regional differences depending on policies and resource potentials, but the common thread is clear. Solar PV and wind are really leading these transitions and are leading this almost everywhere. Now, the rising share of VRE and the increasing electrification of end users. So we see a rising proliferation of EVs in many regions. We see regions, parts of the US, but also parts of Europe increasingly adopting electric heating. And we see a significant adoption of air conditioning in emerging markets too. And all of this is driving up power system flexibility needs in all regions across the world. So short-term flexibility needs, that's essentially the effort required to balance electricity demand and supply on an hourly basis, is expected to increase most strongly. This is driven primarily by solar PV, and that is why regions where the solar uptake is particularly high, for example, on the figure here, India or China, are expected to see especially a strong growth in these short-term flexibility needs. But seasonal needs also go up. This is primarily driven by the electrification and heating and the rise of air conditioning, which makes demand more seasonal. So overall systems in 2035 will require more flexible sources to cope with these variations of demand and renewable supply. And in terms of the flexibility supply, so the sources that actually provide this flex, today, most of this globally is met by a mix of hydro and conventional thermal power plants. But moving forward, we expect that to kind of bifurcate when looking at short-term flexibility and seasonal flexibility, with most of the seasonal flexibility, much of it provided by batteries and demand response. Batteries in particular, we are seeing very strong growth, but demand response too, there's significant potential, especially with the rise in EVs, if we apply smart charging, but also from the electrification of heating and cooling, there's a lot of shifting potential there. And these two become increasingly important sources of flexibility across the world as we move forward in time to 2035. But when looking at seasonal flexibility, of course, we do see continuing importance of hydro and thermal as the main providers of that type of flexibility. This, of course, means that the role of thermal power plants in particular is evolving, especially when looking at this short-term flexibility. With their higher marginal cost of generation, thermal power plants increasingly shift from producing bulk electricity, so baseload operations, to providing flexibility and secure capacity. You can see that on the slides, that this is the case for the gas fleet in Europe, for example, with a significant increase in hours when plants run only little or not at all as we move towards 2035, while continuing to run at close to their maximum capacity in critical hours with high net load. But as you can see on the right-hand slide, this is also going to be the case for coal fleets in emerging markets, or in many emerging markets that see significant increase in solar penetration, such as China or India. So these coal plants will increasingly cycle, operate less frequently, but remain important for reliability. Now, while the distinction between variable renewables and clean firm sources can be a useful one, the significant drop, I think that's important to emphasize, in the cost of battery storage, so over 90% in the past decade, is kind of starting to blur this line. So we've looked at the cost development of hybrid solar PV and battery systems, which are able to provide firm electricity most of the time, and found that they are already competitive today with new coal-fired power in India, and set to become competitive with new coal-fired power in China as over the coming years, and with gas-fired power in parts of the United States over the next couple of years. So this is based on our analysis of both the cost of the technologies and the value that they provide to the system. So when you pair a battery with a PV array, it helps to align the output with electricity demand, including peak demand, which makes the value of this combined system comparable to that of a coal or gas-fired power plant. And yeah, the increasingly favorable economics and versatility of battery storage is reflected in our projections for capacity additions. If we look at the global pipeline of grid-scale batteries, we are on track to exceed the historical peak in global natural gas-fired capacity additions, which was at over 100 gigawatts in 2005, by around 2026. And the amount of battery storage capacity added by 2030 in our stated policy scenario is actually bigger than the capacity of all new fossil fuel capacity added over that same period of time. Now let's take a look at other clean firm options, starting with nuclear, in particular small modular reactors. So what you can see here is our capital cost estimates for nuclear projects in the US and China. And as you can see on the figure, is that first of a kind SMR project costs are likely to be very high. So in the US, for example, we would be looking at over $10,000 per kilowatt. And it will be critical to gain from construction experience and to actually build reactors in series to drive down these costs. Now, if this is achieved, SMRs could eventually reach cost parity with large-scale reactors in pure capital cost terms, but even before that, their smaller size, so their smaller size means that total expenditures of an SMR project would actually be more comparable to a large renewable project or a gas-fired plant rather than, you know, a large nuclear reactor, and that would make financing cheaper and easier to obtain. They are also modular, so there's potentially shorter timelines to go from project inception to commissioning. So you would essentially be would essentially start generating and earning revenue earlier. And all of this, so essentially the smaller size, the modularity, and the accelerated deployment timelines could make them a more attractive option for investors, even with, you know, overall capital costs on a per kilowatt basis being somewhat higher than large-scale nuclear projects. Of course, if those costs come down, there is a significant upside potential for SMRs. And that is being recognized in a lot of countries. So we've actually recently published our first outlook for SMRs based on corporate announcements and existing policies and plans. You see that in the figure on the right. So the US is leading in SMR innovation today, with a lot of companies developing the technology and a lot of interest, in particular from tech companies, to use these to power data centers. But China too is already operating and building SMRs and is on track to actually lead deployment with 3 key designs focusing on electricity heating and desalination. In the EU, there's a lot of interest as well, and in the UK too. And India too has been looking at SMRs to decarbonize industry and replace coal-fired power plants. And if costs do come down, we expect significant additions to occur, in particular after 2030, and global SMR capacity could exceed 120 gigawatts by 2050. But of course, important to emphasize that this is really highly contingent on those promised cost reductions actually materializing. Now, another technology that has been making quite a splash recently is next generation geothermal, with companies such as Fervo in the US or Ever in Canada, opening up new geothermal resources through the application of technologies that originally that come from oil and gas, such as horizontal drilling or fracking. The beauty of these technologies is that they work in absence of classical geothermal reservoirs potentials. So potentials are large and much more widespread than classical geothermal potentials. But the caveat being that the costs of this are currently still very, very high. And the bulk of that cost is for well drilling. But that means as well is that even though the cost is high, there's a lot of experience, in well drilling, in well completion in the oil and gas industry. So a transfer of skills and data and technology from that industry could potentially bring down costs significantly over the coming decade. And what you can see here is our estimate of the levelized cost of such a next generation geothermal plant. Should there be a high level of spillover of knowledge and experience from the oil and gas industry, combined with innovation and significant economies of scale. And what this could do is bring costs down significantly to about around maybe $4,000 per kilowatt by 2035, which means that the LCOE would be around $50 per megawatt hour, so quite competitive in fact. And what this means is that this could, of course, unlock significant potential in many regions of the world, most notably China and the US, but also in Europe, India, and Southeast Asia. But as with SMRs, I mean, this outlook is contingent on these very substantial cost reductions actually materializing, which is by no means certain. Now, before I stop, I want to emphasize that when evaluating the role of different firm or clean firm technologies in low emissions energy systems, it's actually important to consider what their economic and technical characteristics are, which determine what they are best deployed for. So not all of them are necessarily capital intensive, not all of them, so the marginal costs differ quite significantly between the different options. So not all of them are as flexible as some others. So all of these characteristics will determine what they are best used for. An SMR or a next-gen geothermal plant, for example, will remain very capital intensive, even if costs come down significantly. So you wouldn't really want to run it for flex. You would pretty much prefer to run it flat out for as much as possible. And the opposite is true for gas peakers. Even more so if they are hydrogen fueled. They are very high marginal cost, but very cheap to build. That means you would ideally want to use them for backup capacity and seasonal flex, but not really for baseload power provision. And on top of that, we shouldn't forget about the important role of demand response and grids in reducing the overall need for new generating capacity and making the system as a whole more cost effective. And I think that's why we at the IEA espouse an all of the above approach. What we really need is a portfolio with different technologies filling different roles depending on their technical and cost characteristics. And with that, I hand back over to you, Steve.